Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Nobody bringing you another episode of Making Nobody Happy. Today, I want to talk about Christianity and moral skepticism. So, I recently remarked to my wife that most of what people take for their morals are really just the product of their circumstances and the demands placed on them. What people value depends on the necessity or luxury of being able to value them, and so they vary according to the situation. So most people who imagine themselves as sitting in one place would find themselves just like everybody else in another situation. You do what you need to do and you do what you can do. And most people aren't much better than whatever those demands and opportunities allow. Doesn't that make you a moral relativist? She asked. No, I said, it makes me a moral psychologist. Understanding why people believe what they believe isn't the same thing as saying that there isn't anything they should believe. I don't know, she said. It sounds like you're justifying some pretty terrible things. It's not easy to square that with being a Christian. And to that, I also have to disagree. I can't summarize exactly what I said at the time, but I can summarize what I think. In point of fact, I think Christianity leads you right to the very position that I was just expressing. Many people would identify with some sort of psychological or cultural skepticism. But let me explain. So first, as a faith, Christianity has never been afraid to tell the hard truths about the world and about ourselves. It tells a rough and complex story about all kinds of people struggling through a very confusing and challenging world. Neither the picture of God, nor of the world, nor of the people that the Bible offers has the simplicity of a cut and dried ideology. They're astonishing and terrifying in turn. They surprise and disappoint us continually, as real people do, as life does. One of the hard truths, one of those key hard truths, is the sinfulness of all. Men and women, young and old, modern and ancient. You are not better than anyone who has ever lived innately. All have fallen, all have gone astray. It is the central fact of Christianity that mankind is in need of saving and is capable of things it can hardly comprehend, both positively and negatively. If you haven't come to terms with that about the human race, the entire human race, including your favorite bits of it, including yourself, then you haven't come to terms with either the fact of sin or the need for grace. And therefore, you have not in any real way grasped the most important and core message of the Bible. Now, you could argue that Christianity cannot, in fact, cure the disease that it diagnoses, that its hope of salvation is a false hope. In fact, I think you could take that position and still have succeeded in grasping, even if you're not believing, the Christian gospel. So regardless of whether you think that Christ actually has the power to save us from our sins or grant us eternal life, I think that it's undeniable that Christianity has correctly diagnosed the disease. And even if the disease is uncurable by the means that it proposes, diagnosing it is still an accomplishment. And faith at least takes a good stab at managing what is then essentially a terminal condition. Now, I don't think there has ever been a more accurate and complete picture of the problem of human existence as what the Bible presents. And I have certainly looked. I spent an awful lot of time studying different religions and philosophies. And the Bible presents this picture in some very unusual ways through stories and poetry and songs and history and speeches and biographies. So much of the content of Christianity is locked up in forms other than just declamatory prose. And it invites exploration and thought rather than mere collection. The truths it teaches cannot merely be taught, they must be thought through. They have to actually be experienced. They have to be alive. In fact, one of the problems from a structural point of view for its later followers is that the book doesn't always tell you what to make of it. It leaves you with an obligation to consideration that leads to a great variety of interpretation and to lots of disagreement. Often modern Christians, as well as the critics of Christianity, try to sell us in turn on the idea of the faith as something either absurdly meek and wishful and effete and vague and indulgent and open, or they try to sell it as something absurdly harsh and draconian and confrontational and unequivocal and demanding and discriminating. And they'll happily describe Christians as both sheep and wolves in turn. Now, this strange schism, both in advocacy, the things we say in favor of it, and in criticism, the things people say against it, it's perfectly understandable. You'll find plenty of fodder for both interpretations in there. In any case, a non-believer who has truly grasped the reality of sin might be closer to the kingdom than a pious priest of a more naive and self-righteous cult. That's definitely that's a message you get from the Bible. Now, cults are what happen when this great, seething, terrifying, glorious mass of the faith gets cut down to a more manageable ideology, a reduction of its being to a single element, a limited truth, a limited purpose, something more manageable and containable for human minds and hands, something much more formulaic. That's why cults are so easily steered to someone's personal ends, while the greater faith as a whole is so hard to contain and direct and is so messy and diverse. Now, the temptation to limit the scope of the Bible is always the greatest temptation. We wish to cut it down to our own size, to something we alone could have thought of and can interpret fully. That eliminates our reliance on others, as well as any pesky reawakenings or contrary notions the text might try to force on us. We don't just desire truth, after all. We desire a truth that we can possess. And if we can possess the truth, then we can also possess the way and the life. And that's halfway to being God. And the prospect of God becoming something far more manageable and containable in us is far more appealing than letting ourselves be split and torn open in the impossible task of trying to become more like Him. To return to the earlier question, no, I'm not a relativist, but people are, cultures are. It's the easiest thing in the world. And we vastly underestimate how much we've gone wandering after our own concerns, how much we merely echo the luxuries or demands of our own situation. We indulge in beneficence when it benefits us. We indulge in tyranny when it benefits us. And many, probably most people, live as their particular nature and the conditions of their world demand that they live. Bad or good, soft or harsh, bold or cautious, considerate or calculating. Most of us are no better or no worse than any others who have ever lived. We would do just as they'd have done were we in their shoes. The values we hold today are largely just the fashions, necessities, and luxuries of our time. And if our structures around us suddenly changed drastically, or we were transported back in time or forward into a new state of affairs by a fickle turn of history, we'd find out we're a little different from anyone else. A good example my dad once gave me of this was what happened in the prison camps in China, where Eric Liddell ended up. And educated people, all of them Christians, most of them working at missions, at mission-funded universities. And then all of a sudden, the war happens and they all get put into an internment camp. And it's a completely different world. And you learn a lot of lessons about human nature from that. Very few people had the courage and fortitude to really act the way we imagine ourselves, the way that we think we would act. Very, very few, maybe one or two people. Eric Liddell is the big standout on there. Most people very quickly just responded to the demands of the situation. So, to come back to the question, why are we so fascinated by stories, real or imagined, of an apocalypse where the world in some form ends and people revert to a savage state? We don't just feel it to be true. There's some part of us that even seems to wish it to be true and fondles the idea of having our constrained potential unleashed and tested. Some part of us longs for the chance to make a novel choice, to act as we truly would and not merely as a byproduct of our present limits, and to discover that freedom or that slavery by an upending of all the established rules. Now, it's hard to say if this desire is perverse or noble. The outcomes for most of us would be, I think, a lot less good than we would hope. Only a tiny minority of people turn out to be genuine heroes in a pinch. I remarked to my wife recently on a much less serious and more nerdy matter that the original Star Trek lay all the groundwork for the story arc of the Klingon Empire, and the Next Generation and Deep Space Nine just followed through on it. Now, bear with me. I know I'm bringing up Star Trek. This actually does have some relevance. So we're told quite clearly in the original series that one day the Federation and the Klingons will be great friends, uniting their strengths of the Space Yankees and the Space Scots-Irish. At the time, this seems completely impossible to both sides. The Klingons are clearly the villains of the galaxy, brutal and aggressive, the sworn enemies of the idealistic and peaceful Federation. So how could such enemies become friends without completely changing who they are or giving up on their most essential beliefs and character? The guiding beliefs of the Klingons are what drive them, for good or bad, and make them what they are. Survival must be earned. That's their first core belief. And Klingons play the game to win. That's their second. So it's one of the little surprises in life to find out there are people who approach life differently than you do. Some people truly don't play to win, and some may even play to lose to others. And plenty of other people feel that survival and success is a right rather than a privilege that has to be earned. Agreeable and disagreeable people exist, and one of the most shocking discoveries that you can make is that both qualities have their benefits and their vulnerabilities and are likely to be ruined without the other. Again, that's not relativism, just because different perspectives are needed, just because there are different ways of looking at things, just because different times and situations may call for different responses. That's not relativism. Now, my wife, no doubt, would side unequivocally with the Federation against the Klingons and find it very hard to justify their approach or overlook their pathologies, and they certainly have them. But the Federation has its own pathologies, and the Next Generation really does prove that and explore that, with many episodes revealing the decadence and hesitancy and bureaucratic ineffectiveness of the Federation. So the Federation needs the Klingons. Deep Space Nine proves that. Only the caution, only the suspiciousness to some degree, the disagreeability, and especially the bravery of the Klingons. That's the only thing that saves the Federation from the Dominion. The Federation would have been eaten up by them without the Klingons. Now, I'm not excusing their brutality, but it proceeds, even its perversion, from something that is correct, something that is true, something that can be good and needed. Wisdom lies in recognizing that even in their worst moments, there's some sense and some value in radically opposing approaches. While at the same time, we recognize there is, even in the things that we prefer and approve, the seed of something false and dangerous. The line of good and evil, as Solzhenitsyn said, is drawn down the heart of every man and woman. And in most cases, whether we approve or disapprove of this or that particular action or person, they're following their own path, convinced that it's right, responding to the desires and needs and demands placed upon them, whether that's in the peaceful and benign world of the modern first world country or in the difficult past of a more savage and uncertain time. Savagery and nobility exist in all times and places, and it's not always so easy to identify them as you would think, especially for those who will only ever consent to understand any time or any people but their own. The moral objectivity of even many modern Christians is an ideological luxury, the product of their time, and not the result of any deep consideration of or confrontation with reality. They've never truly been tested because they sincerely do not believe that they are capable of the sorts of things others have thought and done. They cannot have truly grasped the nature of sin or the need for grace. So long as they imagine themselves to be just better or different, so long as they draw moral distinctions based on clocks and conventions, they miss the terrible and wonderful truth that they might be driving their world and their lives into a fate no better and no less terrible than those of the past, and that they are just as able to be given grace as those of the past. That's all for today. Thanks for listening.